When the new commander, Hermann Pista, arrived, the Institute of Hygiene of the SS had but recently established a new clinical laboratory in the camp, under the title Division of Typhus and Virus Research. SS Oberführer Pista would oversee its growth. Despite the number of deaths that took place under his command, he was not of the same ilk as his predecessor. There is no evidence that he was either a brute or a sadist. He was 57 years old at the time he arrived. His background was far removed from that of his peers, having been trained as an automobile mechanic and having come to Himmler's notice as a high-ranking officer in the Reichsführer's Transport Corps. After being put in charge of a series of fortifications in the west, he was moved to Buchenwald. An SS inspector's report states that on January the 19th, 1942, he was given command of the Buchenwald camp, whose previous commander had made a complete mess of it. With great energy, never-ending diligence, and through his own example, he turned Buchenwald into a model camp. Unlike the aggressive Koch, he was an efficient manager who did not go out of his way to make enemies. It is doubtful that Pista would have been able to establish such effective control of the camps without making good use of what has remained one of the most controversial elements of camp life, the capo system. The camp population when he arrived consisted of 7,911 inmates. By the end of 1943, this had quadrupled to 37,319. As the war progressed, things could only get worse and worse. The capos were prisoner foremen, who in the majority of camps were recruited from the Greens or criminal elements in the camps. Buchenwald was somewhat of an exception, partly due to the fact its earliest detainees were imprisoned for political offences. Many were communists. Their experience of working closely together would soon make them more than a match for their criminal competitors, and because of their greater intelligence and skill, lead the SS to place more reliance on them. In 1942, a number of eminent prisoners began to arrive at the camp, including the last French Minister for the Interior, Georges Mandel. He'd been arrested in Morocco, where he'd been continuing the fight against the Nazis. It is said that Winston Churchill, who called him the first French resister, would have preferred to see him as the leader of the Free French forces rather than de Gaulle. He had even been offered a seat on the plane that took de Gaulle to Britain, but refused, saying, "You fear for me because I am a Jew. Well, it's because I am a Jew that I shall stay." He was taken from the camp in 1944 as a hostage to guarantee the good behavior of the Maquis French resistance movement, and was then executed by the collaborating French militia in the forest of Fontainebleau. This was also the year in which the first subcamp was established in an armament factory, the Gustloff-Werke Weimar. By the end of the war, Buchenwald have 139 subcamps, reaching from the borders of Bohemia as far west as the border with France. Ohrdruf, created in 1944, was a typical example of such a camp. Little is left of it today. It was set up to create a vast communications center, never to be completed, with a population of 11,700 men. It was the first camp to be liberated by the Americans. Although theoretically all the main camps had their own area of authority, many subcamps had little geographic proximity to their parent camp and came into existence through contacts and opportunism. They would either undertake work on behalf of the government or the private sector. In the case of the latter, this is how it would work. An enterprise might either approach or be approached to discuss the possibility of labour being supplied at a daily rate of between 4 and 6 marks. Lack of facilities to provide for the migrant slave labour force was no obstacle. As in Buchenwald itself, the workers would build their own prison. Conditions varied considerably, but since the aim was exploitation at the lowest possible cost, they varied from bad to worse. Some of these camps would have had more than one parent camp involved in the supply of hands. Large armaments or steelworks, where the slave labour force could rise as high as 150,000 hands, would need to recruit its workers from a number of different camps. Ward or Barrack 46 began to gain its infamous reputation as experiments using the typhus vaccine began in January, at first in Barracks 44 and 49. They would have proved to be of little scientific value, since the scientific methodology was flawed. No attention was paid to quantitative or qualitative analysis. In the first experiment, 5 out of 145 patients injected with the typhus serum died. Later, further experiments were carried out using strains of both typhus and yellow fever. Of roughly 1,000 prisoners who passed through Ward 46, 158 died as a result of their treatment. The list makers found the ward a convenient way of eliminating those who they regarded as enemies. As for the SS, they kept well away. Because of this, Ward 46 was to offer sanctuary to a select number of individuals under threat of death. This was due to the fact that Erwin Ding Schuler, the SS officer and doctor in charge of the experiments, fell under the influence of his chief clerk, Eugen Kogen, and turned a blind eye to the use of Ward 46 for good. Like many others, as the war dragged on, his commitment to the cause he had espoused weakened. Towards the end, he would wryly comment, "You can't deny, Kogen, that it's quite an accomplishment to have put the 1,000-year Reich under the sod in a mere 5 years." A moody individual with a grim past, he committed suicide shortly after being arrested as a war criminal. Before the year was out, the final struggle between the Greens and the Reds for control of the camp took place. It centered around one of the prisoner foremen, Oels, who smuggled a shortwave receiver into a sewerage duct. His strategy to undermine the political capos was to communicate the news received in this way through third parties. And as the leftist activists disseminated it through the camp, to report them to the political department for passing on foreign reports. 50 of the Reds were removed from their posts and sent to the quarries, and Oels became senior camp inmate. The situation was reversed when a political prisoner discovered the receiver and reported it. Oels was transferred to the quarries and found dead the next day. Many of his closest allies would follow him. His successor was denounced by the Reds and accused of orchestrating a political plot. He was transferred to an outside detail and died shortly after. The rule of the Reds was never challenged again. Three former French prime ministers arrived in the camp in 1943, Léon Blum, Edouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud. Blum was both the first socialist and the first Jew to hold the position of prime minister in France, which he held not once but 3 times. He refused to flee the country and denounced the collaborationist Vichy government. Subsequently arrested, he shared living accommodation with the Jewish Minister of the Interior, Paul Mandel. Towards the end of the war, instructions were issued he was to be shot, but the camp authorities, alarmed at possible reprisals, ignored the order. Paul Reynaud was the man whose reforming ideas had dragged France out of the recession. However, his ministry was destabilized by left and right extremes, the right wishing him to lead an attack not on Germany but the Soviet Union. He was forced to resign, opening the way for the Vichy government of Marshal Pétain. The last of the triad, Edouard Daladier, had been forced into a pacifist stance against Hitler due to a lack of British support. He returned from the Munich Accord to face a huge crowd at the airport. Expecting them to be jeering him, he was shocked to find he was welcomed with applause, and turned to his aide murmuring, "Les cons," a vulgar association of the crowd with a part of the female anatomy. These privileged prisoners were housed in the falconry. With the departure of the Kochs, it had fallen into neglect. Just how far removed these VIPs were from the torments of the barbed wire encampment may be seen from the testament of Leon Blum. The severity of our isolation explains a fact which is incomprehensible at first. I mean our long-lasting ignorance of the unutterable horrors that took place only a few hundred yards from where we were. He goes on to state that the first hint of what was going on came in the form of strange smells wafting from the crematorium. In March of this year, the armaments factory of Gustav Werke of Weimar created a new factory right next to the camp, again built by the prisoners. They were already benefiting from a sub-camp that had been constructed outside the main works. The company had been founded as Simon & Co. in 1856, and in the decade up to 1933 were designated the sole manufacturers of Lugers and military rifles. With Hitler's rise to power, this Jewish company had had its assets seized, and the Simon family had sought shelter in the United States. The company was named after an anti-Semitic Nazi leader, Gustloff, who was shot dead by a Jewish student. Conditions in both the works were superior to those in the main camp and were staffed mainly by communist political prisoners. Once again, the underground network was looking after its own. Although being caught in an act of direct sabotage, such as damaging machinery, would involve the most dreadful punishments, there were ways of slowing down production that the SS were powerless to prevent. Most civilian foremen and engineers in the factories had been chosen on account of their Nazi affiliations rather than their knowledge, skill, or competence. They were bound to rely on the prisoners. The program of sabotage involved faulty planning and building, causing delays in obtaining tools and machinery, and applying official regulations and testing procedures to the letter, causing further setbacks. Due to the difference in levels of education and technical training, the political prisoners were more than a match for the Nazi policemen. What was not allowed to be delayed for any reason whatsoever was the new railway. With 2 factories in the camp, it was decided that Buchenwald should have a modern means of transporting its goods to the outer world. The construction of this new line was ordered by Heinrich Himmler on his visit to the camp on the 26th of February 1943. His instructions were that it should be ready for a test run on the 21st of June. The track to Weimar would be 13 miles in length, proceeding down a steep incline of almost 1,000 feet, and the ground on which the track was to be laid was clay mixed with rock. Calling out the dogs from the kennels, a first lieutenant who was a notorious slave driver was put in charge. Working 12-hour shifts, during which many men died, and during which major accidents exceeded a dozen a day, the line was completed. The SS celebrated with beer and schnapps and also received a considerable cash bonus. The prisoners received a bath. After the trial run, it was found the rails had sagged so badly during this one trial that further use was unsafe. It took a further 6 months to rectify the faults. Once completed, it would become the means by which many prisoners would be sent to their deaths, either in extermination camps or by being worked and starved to death in the sub-camps. On this line, more than 120,000 prisoners arrived at Buchenwald, many to be shipped out to other camps. The station here was the loading point used to transport prisoners to the death camps, and from it one of the most notorious of all the SS trains would leave at the war's end, the death train to Dachau. Himmler also gave orders that the concentration camp workers were to be used for the fourth in the series of aggregate rockets, or the A4, which later was better known to the world as the V2, the Vengeance rocket named by Himmler himself. The new sub-camp was situated near Nordhausen, and the camp was known as Mittelbau Dora, or just Dora. The first 107 workers arrived in August from Buchenwald, and in September another 1,223 followed. They were employed in tunneling, digging a vast underground network to protect the secrecy and safety of this ultimate weapon of war. By the time the tunnel system was completed, 2,900 prisoners had lost their lives. The facility became operational in October 1943, when it was supporting 32,471 prisoners. In its lifetime, roughly 60,000 prisoners would pass through it. A third of these were to die. 350 were hanged, of which 200 were sentenced for acts of sabotage. 9,000 died from exhaustion, and the rest died from disease and starvation. Another initiative undertaken by Himmler in this year was the introduction of brothels to the camps. This was despite the fact that the National Socialists had passed laws against prostitution. Each camp had roughly 20 girls shipped in from the women's camp of Ravensbrück. In the case of Buchenwald, the new arrivals numbered 16. Whether the girls involved were volunteers or not is a matter of dispute. What is known is that they were convicts. Theoretically, they had to be Germans, although Poles were later accepted. Jews were not eligible to become whores. Neither were Jewish men, even of the prisoner foreman class, allowed to make use of the facilities provided. This was due to the Nuremberg laws, which forbade sexual relations between Jews and Aryans. It is said that the girls were promised a release after 6 months of service, but this was not to be the case. The main function of the brothel was to provide an incentive for the camp workers. It formed part of the bonus system relating to good work, for which the SS would distribute coupons marked with a certain value and known as camp money. Visiting a girl cost 2 marks, and where a prisoner who qualified for the privilege lacked the funds, the SS were ready to accommodate him, later invoicing his family for the services received. Bonus coupons were introduced for a variety of incentives apart from those of a sexual nature. They could be used to purchase extra food or better clothing or cigarettes. Their introduction was a sign of recognition by the Reich that the whip and the gallows were not in themselves sufficient. It also revealed their increasing dependency on slave labor, which was no longer merely a form of punishment, nor merely a way of lining the pockets of the overseers. The survival of the fatherland was becoming dependent on it. In addition to incentivizing the workers, it was hoped that offering such options to a select number, who included the camp leaders, would break down any sense of prison solidarity. Apart from the brothels, few women stayed at Buchenwald, although towards the end of the war, as the tides of migrants from one camp to another swelled and the situation became more chaotic, the numbers could surpass the 500 mark. However, in the sub-camps, large numbers of females came under the control of Buchenwald, by the end of the war reaching 27,000 and beyond, stretching across 28 camps. One camp was set next to the Nobel factory, where they were forced to handle nitrate products used for making dynamite without any kind of protective clothing. These would dye their hands and hair green and lead to irreversible liver and lung damage and subsequent death. Experiments began on homosexuals during the year, involving glandular surgery. The first test involved 5 of the inmates. The number of convicted homosexuals in the camp was never great, increasing from 1 in 1937 to 189 in 1944. Homosexuality had been a crime long before the Nazis came to power, but it was Himmler's paranoia that condemned homosexuals to persecution. So appealing did he perceive this form of sexual activity to be that he felt it posed a threat to the continued existence of the Aryan race. In 1937, he had preached to a group of the SS elect. "We have to be clear about the fact that if we continue to have this vice in Germany without the means of eradicating it, then that will be the end of Germany, the end of the German world." Identified by a pink badge, the convicted homosexuals were shunned by the other prisoners and spent most of their time isolated in delinquent cells. In their behavior towards the men with the pink badges, the prisoners emulated the attitude of their captors. Incongruously, homosexuality was widespread throughout the camp, and its existence was tolerated. Only those with a pink badge were treated as pariahs. Other experiments using typhus serums continued in Ward 66, with the death rates rising as high as 50%. There were 2 new arrivals of particular note in January of 1944. The first was a Frenchman, Paul Racinier, who has been called the father of Holocaust deniers. The other was the Italian princess Mafalda of Savoy. Racinier was a man of contradictions. He had served in the French army in Morocco in the 20s, and what he saw there made him a pacifist. "We became deadened to scandalous scenes of torture, which had no reason to envy those of the Middle Ages, and we saw the apparatus of dictatorship advancing." He became a communist and a passionate opponent of fascism and Nazism. For all that, he supported the Munich Agreement on pacifist grounds. His advocacy of passive rather than active resistance led the communists to put a sentence of death on him. But before that could be carried out, he had been badly beaten by the SS and thrown into Buchenwald. Here he saw the communist underground as being quite as bad as their Nazi guards, and after the war claimed that a false picture was being painted of the camps by communists and Zionists for their own political purposes. To quote his position on the camps, "The problem was a universal one, not just one that could be got rid of by placing it on the doorstep of the National Socialists." He died in 1967, his death brought on by complications arising from his beatings by the SS. Princess Mafalda, the sister of the future King of Italy, Umberto III, was married to Prince Philip of Hesse, a devoted member of the National Socialist Party. Despite this, she ran foul of Hitler, who called her the blackest carrion in the Italian royal house. She was arrested for subversive activities, although it is probable that the true reason was that the Germans wished to ensure that her father, King Victor Emmanuel III, continued to support or at least tolerate fascism and National Socialism. Unlike Racinier, she joined the ranks of privileged prisoners with her own lodgings. By March of 1944, half the camp were either working in the 2 armaments factories attached to the camp or in the Weimar factory. 1 in 10 was suffering from tuberculosis. Already in 1941, by some strange arithmetic, the Nazi doctors had calculated, in their own words, when there were enough TB patients in the camp. Full stop. The surplus was killed using sodium evipan, injected either intravenously or straight to the heart. At the same time that these purges were being carried out, another arm of the security services was sending mobile medical X-ray units to the camps, diagnosing and treating victims of the disease. A new little camp was constructed to the north of the barracks area to cope with the increasing volume of shipments of prisoners. Its main purpose was to serve as a transit camp for slave labor on its way to one of the sub-camps. It consisted of 12 windowless, stable blocks that measured 131 feet by 33 feet. There were no beds or sanitary facilities. One of these constructs was designated as the Little Camp Hospital. It was also to be known as the killing station. Captain Shilowski ordered that all the infirm and disabled among the newcomers should be taken there directly. The senior block inmates of the little camp were also given instructions that all those deemed incapable of survival in their block be selected and sent to building number 61, which was cut off by barbed wire from the little camp, an area already split off from the main camp by a barbed wire fence. Here, in a life or death lottery, they either received medical treatment or were directed to a room with a door marked with a B, where they received a fatal injection. The list for those selected for Building 61 were again made up of the communists. Many men were saved due to their political affiliations, but as many fit men were sentenced to death to make up the lists. The normal weekly death toll was around 150 men, though it could surge to as high as 500. However bad things were in the main camp, in the little camp life was far worse. Conditions were appalling as the influx of non-Germans into the camp mounted, and huts that had been planned to squeeze in 500 men now had to find room for up to 2,000. So cramped were conditions that it was difficult to answer the calls of nature once the men settled down for the night. In Block 61, most prisoners were suffering from dysentery, and bedding was removed as they relieved themselves where they lay. Open sewers ran through the camp. Bowls were treasured by their owners, who tied them for security around their persons. There was no organization such as existed in the main camp, and any attempt to impose one swept away by the influx of new arrivals. Food could only be obtained by fighting to get it. Deaths mounted and rose to 200 on certain days. The crematory had proved to be a good investment. Fueled with coke, the flames of Buchenwald could sometimes be seen rising 3 feet beyond the smokestack. The hardened prisoners would even make jokes as to which sort of victim the smoke represented, Jew, convict, or Jehovah's Witness. It became so busy that the workers were excused roll call and asked to identify themselves simply by sticking their heads out of the window. The ashes that were shipped back to the families of the German or Czech inmates were random handfuls of ashes taken from a common pile. No other kind of prisoner warranted such ceremony, and it was not unusual for a charge to be made for the service. Jews were not only shipped out to Auschwitz. By 1944, some were singled out as being able to undertake hard labor and were sent to Buchenwald. 8,000 Hungarian Jews arrived between May and July. Worked to death, they were a harbinger of things to come as the Eastern Front moved closer to Germany, pushed forward by the Soviet troops. They swelled the numbers in the little camp. In the west, too, the front was closing in, and by August, camps nearby were being closed and the interns being marched back to central Germany. The camp was now stretched beyond its limits, and new arrivals in the little camp slept where they fell, without a roof to shelter them. It was in this month that Ernst Thälmann, the chairman of the German Communist Party, was shot in the crematorium. Even prisoners of war were consigned to the little camp. 167 Allied airmen who had been shot down over France were sent there from Paris. Amongst them was Roy Allen, the pilot of a B-17 Flying Fortress who had parachuted to safety when his plane was shot down. The treatment they received was in defiance of the Geneva Convention of which Germany was a signatory. It took 2 months before their plight was relieved, and they were sent to a POW camp, Stalag Luft III, famous for being the camp where the Great Escape took place. In those 2 months he had shed 80 pounds and weighed a mere 110 pounds. Throughout the year, the parent camp of Buchenwald became actively involved in Himmelfahrttransporte, which means transport going to heaven. The SS knew it by another name, Verschrottung, or scrapping. These were 2 different ways to describe the same thing, the selection of the sick and disabled for transfer to the extermination camps of Auschwitz and Majdanek. In August, 1600 Sinti and Romani arrived from Auschwitz. The 2 people formed together the Gypsy community, the Romani having converted to Islam at the time of the Seljuk Empire to gain their freedom, and the Sinti having refused and remained as slaves. The rounding up and extermination of the Gypsies had been taking place since shortly after the invasion of Poland, and the Gypsy camp at Auschwitz had received over 23,000. Most of them were already dead. For those who arrived, Buchenwald was no more than a transit camp on the way to the underground workings of Camp Dora, the secret home of the V2. Others, the sick and exhausted, were shipped back to Auschwitz for extermination before the year was out. Further transports took place, including one of the Jewish and Gypsy youngsters, who were described as being surrounded by a wall of carbines, desperately trying to get their fathers or protectors to come to their aid. They had been 4 weeks in the camp, having been sent there from Auschwitz before being returned. As supplies dwindled, all problems were solved by shunting the weaker members of the prison community onto other camps. The various shipments from one camp to another were a symptom of the front moving ever closer to the heart of Germany. On August the 24th, Buchenwald was to come to the realization of just how close it was. At 10 to 4 in the morning of that day, 401 Bomber Group had learned its mission for the day. It formed part of the 8th Air Force, which was sending out a total of 1,300 bombers over Europe, to which 401 would contribute 3 flights of 12 aircraft plus 3 spare, or 39 B-17 Flying Fortresses in all. Altogether, 129 bombers were assigned to the mission. The targets were the 2 armaments factories of Buchenwald. As they reached their assigned altitude of 20,000 feet, they were attacked by a squadron of Me-109s, and 3 of the planes were lost. The spare planes had all to be recalled due to mechanical problems, leaving 33 to continue with the mission. The prisoners working in the factories were able to see a lone plane approaching. Those in the know took it to be a Pathfinder, an advance aircraft that would drop a flare to highlight the target for the approaching bombers. They were wrong. It was to drop the first bomb. In the course of the attack, 175 1,000-pound and 583 500-pound high-explosive bombs were dropped, together with 279 500-pound incendiary bombs. The 2 factories were obliterated. The first photograph shows the camp before the attack, with the prisoners' camp on the upper right corner, the SS quarters forming a semicircle, and the factory in the lower right corner. The second photograph shows the bombs hitting with astonishing accuracy. And the last, the camp after the raid. Bombs also fell on the SS barracks and the officers' homes. Only 3 bombs fell on the prisoners' main camp, and none on the little camp. The isolation barracks was destroyed. This was where many of the celebrity prisoners were held, surrounded by a 10-foot stockade and guarded by 122 SS men. Rudolf Breitscheid, the leader of the Social Democratic Party in the Weimar Republic, was said to have been killed in the raid. However, so, according to the Nazis, was the communist leader Ernst Thälmann, who is known to have been executed. Some think it possible that Breitscheid suffered a similar fate. In both cases, the SS wished to evade responsibility. One victim, whose fate is not open to dispute, was Princess Malfada. Severely wounded, her arm was amputated in the camp, but she died the next day. 80 members of the SS, together with 24 family members, were killed in the attack, including the wife and daughter of Camp Commander Pista. Another 283 were wounded. Of the prisoners, 384 died and a further 600 were wounded. Most died either in the vicinity of the factories or when a bomb intended for the SS barracks landed in the quarry with devastating effect. Goethe's oak was killed in the raid. It had been held that when this tree fell, Germany would fall with it. The badly damaged tree had to be cut down, but the camp personnel carefully preserved the stump. The prisoners were assembled in the Appelplatz immediately after the raid to be greeted by a fully manned MG-42 machine gun. It was with great relief they discovered they had been called together to receive instructions that they were to do their best to put out the fires in the factory, rather than to be annihilated. It was all to no avail. Neither the DAW nor the Gastlaufwerke would ever function again. The next month, the SS hanged 34 French, Belgian, English and Canadian members of the Secret Service in the cellar of the crematorium. During this month, a selection was made of Jews who had been returned to Buchenwald for reasons of health. They were summoned to the cinema, where a selection was made. Out of 1,600, 1,188 were declared unfit and were shipped to Auschwitz. Over the next quarter, a further 2,000 Sinti, Romani, and Jews were transported to that most dreadful of camps. With the new year, the approach of the Red Army led to the dissolution of all the camps in Poland. No longer would undesirables be shipped eastward. The direction of the flow was to reverse. The Soviets had been building up large amounts of manpower and materials behind the front presented by the Vistula River, to the point where they now vastly outnumbered the Germans in infantry, artillery, and armour. Although all this was known to German intelligence, Hitler refused to believe it, claiming quaintly it was the greatest imposture since Genghis Khan. Whether or not Genghis Khan was an imposture, the Russian army was not. It was now to sweep away everything standing between itself and Berlin. The Vistula was breached in mid-January. Camps in Poland had been closing since the end of 1944, with the prisoners, mainly Jews, being forced marched to alternative lodgings, frequently Auschwitz. In November, Himmler had ordered the destruction of the gas chambers and the crematoria, and the prisoners had been employed in dismantling and dynamiting the camp. With the breaching of the Vistula front on the 12th of January, preparations began for the evacuation of the camp, and on the 18th of January, the ghastly death marches began. By the time the Red Army arrived at the camp on January the 27th, only 7,000 inhabitants remained, 60,000 had been marched out, of which 15,000 were to die on the way. During this month, Buchenwald received 4,200 Jews from Częstochowa, a further 7,200 who were mainly Jewish from Auschwitz, and another 7,800 people who again were mainly Jewish from Gross-Rosen. By the beginning of February, Buchenwald would claim another record. It was the largest concentration camp remaining, with 112,000 prisoners distributed between the parent and the subcamps. The little camp was bursting at the seams as thousands more came back to the original parent from the newly independent camp of Dora. One of the new arrivals from Auschwitz was Elie Wiesel, a future winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. He arrived in Buchenwald on January the 29th together with his father, who died shortly after. He himself would survive it and live to speak out on behalf of Israel, as well against the plight of victims of apartheid, the Argentinian desaparecidos and the Kurds, amongst many other disposed people. Even at this late stage of the Third Reich, some semblance of order could be perceived amongst the chaos, as prominent prisoners continued to arrive, for whom one of the barracks had been specifically prepared, the new isolation barracks. It was kitted out to receive the families of the men who had been involved in the bomb plot against Hitler, the assassination attempt that had nearly succeeded in eliminating the increasingly demented warlord the previous July. In February 1945, the family of Stauffenberg arrived, together with others whose relations had been involved in the plot. As typhus and typhoid brought by the migrating hordes spread like wildfire among the prison population, the food supplies diminished further, and the camp started to starve to death. It was clear that the war was coming to an end, and that victory was on the side of the Allies. The worst fear was that the camps would be bombed by the Luftwaffe in an attempt to eradicate all evidence that they had ever existed. For all other contingencies, plans were being made. The bombing raid of August the 24th and the ensuing chaos had facilitated the obtaining of rifles, pistols, carbines, and hand grenades. These had been buried or walled up, with their whereabouts known only to a select few. Should orders come to mow down the prisoners with machine guns and grenades, they would be prepared. Two groups were putting the final touches to their plans, the communists and non-communists, led by the British Captain Burney. His group was recruited solely on ability and commitment, rather than on party political lines. Fear reigned in the camp, but now it was a mutual fear between the SS and their slave labourers. On April the 2nd, Himmler phoned the commandant of the Ohrdruf camp to tell him he was leaving it to his discretion as to whether he was to liquidate the convicts and political prisoners. The Jews were not to be touched. It appears that at this late stage in the game, Himmler believed that he could use the remaining Jews as a bargaining counter, perhaps even to the point of convincing the Allies that he should be put in control of a defeated Germany. In Buchenwald, Pista vacillated. Ohrdruf, that had claimed so many lives, had not managed to complete the railway that was to support the great communication centre, let alone the communication centre itself. General Patton was told that from the beginning of the year to the day of liberation, 3,000 more had died, either through starvation or being shot in the head. In late March, the SS completed a final massacre of many of the sick and dying, before sending the remaining 11,700 off on a death march to Buchenwald. On April the 5th, they completed the last leg of their journey, the dozen miles between Weimar and Buchenwald. 74 died in this brief stretch, some finished off by members of the Hitler Youth or by women. They arrived in their parent camp the day after Ohrdruf was liberated. The 4th Armored Division and the 89th Infantry Division, which included President Barack Obama's great-uncle, the 20-year-old Charlie Payne, arrived at Ohrdruf on 5th of April. This was the first camp to be liberated by the American Army, and they were unprepared for the sights that would greet them. The bodies were stacked up, some partly decomposed by a thin lime covering, and others half burned. Nobody who witnessed the scene was left unscarred. General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe and future United States President, cabled General George Marshall, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, to describe the effects his visit of April the 12th had on him. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. In one room where there were piled up 20 or 30 naked men, George Patton would not even enter. He said he would get sick if he did so. I made the visit deliberately, in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things, if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. By this date, 47,000 inmates were crammed into Buchenwald. On the afternoon of April 4th, all the Jews were ordered to assemble in the roll call area. This may well have been in line with Himmler's plan to preserve what was left of the Jewish population. Not knowing of this and fearing the worst, the camp resisted, and not one of the Jews appeared. As it turned out, they were wise not to have done so. When an announcement was made to say they were being assembled for transfer abroad, no one believed it. Too many lies had been told. The next day, convicts with clubs were sent into the little camp. But without the aid of the prisoner-staffed camp police, they were only able to collect 1,500 or so, approximately a quarter of the camp population. To them were added the Hungarian Jews arriving from Ohrdruf. With the sounds of the battle approaching and American planes circling overhead, on April the 5th an order was sent out by the Weimar Gestapo that 46 key political prisoners be shot. They immediately went underground. From this time on, no one obeyed when summoned to appear at the gatehouse. This dread command, that in the past had predicted horrific torture and possible death, had lost all its potency. Meanwhile, with a promise of testimonials from influential inmates in his pocket, Pista remarked, "One can always delay carrying out an order." He was in a receipt of a parachuted letter signed on behalf of the British War Office, warning him that another Ohrdruf must not take place. It ended, "Our armoured commanders are approaching to settle your account. You have one more chance." On April the 6th, 3,000 Jews were scheduled to leave Buchenwald, followed by a further 1,500 prisoners on April the 7th, and yet another 4,500 later in the day. The latter were destined for Dachau, and food was provided for a single day, the time the journey would take under normal conditions. But these were not normal times, and the route that was plotted was convoluted in the extreme. 40 trucks were loaded with between 100 and 120 men. They got as far as a little village called Nammering and stuck there. 70 bodies were taken off the train on April the 23rd and cremated. 700 were thrown into a ravine. By evening, the train was on the move again to Dachau. It arrived the same day. When Dachau was liberated the next day, 2,300 corpses were found lying on and around the train. The appalled troops took it upon themselves to execute what they saw as justice on the men they held to be responsible, the remaining camp guards. Further testament regarding the death train would emerge in the subsequent war crimes trials. By the 10th of April, another 14,000 prisoners had been evacuated, but no action would be taken against the political prisoners. The next day, Prince Waldeck, Karl Koch's old enemy and head of the Weimar Gestapo, arrived at the camp to whip Pista into line, as he put it. He suggested blowing up the camp, but he had come too late and found the demoralized SS staff in no mood to follow his instructions. The SS officer in charge announced his intention to surrender. Shortly after, the SS began to withdraw. Only the guards on the watchtower were left and put up little resistance when armed prisoners cut through the fence, stormed the towers and hoisted the white flag. The communist organization took control of the remaining 21,000 prisoners. After heavy fighting to the west of the camp, the American 6th Armored Division entered the camp at 2:30 in the afternoon. Even now, a sense of the surreal continued to manifest itself in the camp. One of the most noted reporters of his day, Ed Murrow, describes how, surrounded as he was by the living dead, one skeletal figure, which introduced itself as a German academic, advised him, "I should be careful of my wallet if I were you. You know, there are criminals here as well." The smell of Buchenwald was overpowering. He continued his report. "There surged around me an evil-smelling stink. Men and boys reached out to touch me. They were in rags and the remnants of uniforms. Death had already marked many of them, but they were smiling with their eyes. I asked to see one of the barracks. When I entered, men tried to lift me to their shoulders. They were too weak. Many of them could not get out of bed. I was told this building had once stabled 80 horses. There were 1,200 men in it, 5 to a bunk. The stink was beyond description. They called the doctor. We inspected his records. Besides the names of those who had died, there was a cross. They totaled 242. 242 out of 1,200 in 1 month. As we walked out into the courtyard, a man fell dead. 2 others, there must have been over 60, were crawling towards the latrine. I saw it, but will not describe it. His report continues. There were 2 rows of bodies stacked up like cordwood. They were very thin and very white. Some of these bodies were terribly bruised, though there seemed to be very little flesh to bruise. Some had been shot through the head, though they bled but little. It appeared that most of the men and boys had died through starvation, not execution. But the manner of death seemed unimportant. Murder had been done at Buchenwald. God alone knows how many boys and men had died there during the last 12 years. I pray you to believe what I have said about Buchenwald. I reported what I saw and heard, but only part of it. For most of it, I have no words. If I have offended you by this rather mild account of Buchenwald, I am not in the least sorry. A US senator described his visit to the hospital where there were hundreds of men, some with running sores, their bodies so devoid of flesh they could not lie for long in one position. Some who were able to stand were little more than skin and bones. One marveled how the knee and ankle joints held together. Up to the date of liberation, 33,462 people perished in Buchenwald. Thousands more died on the death marches, with the figure being estimated at between 12,000 and 15,000. Even after the liberation, the figures mounted into hundreds of further individuals worn away by starvation and sickness. As in Ohrdruf and Dachau, they came across the naked dead in piles, some still in the rail trucks. The ovens were still hot and burning corpses. By the ovens, bodies were still hanging from hooks, waiting for incineration. The reaction of the troops was predictable and savage. They stood by as the prisoners hunted down the 76 guards that had fled and brought them back to the camp to be murdered. Harry Herder, who claimed to be the first of the liberators to enter Buchenwald, described the killing of one of the guards, who had been made to create his own noose. The guard was told to place the noose over his head, around his neck, and draw the noose fairly snug. His eyes were unhooded and open, but the noose kept him from looking down. He was talked to some more, and then he jumped. He was caught before all of his weight was on the rope, and they set him back on the table. The next time he stepped gently off the end, and the table was quickly slid away from him and out of his reach, and he dangled there. He slowly strangled. Elie Wiesel, the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, testified that Weimar, on being occupied the next day, suffered from rape and pillage. The citizens of the town were then invited by the American authorities to visit Buchenwald, since they were assumed to have been aware of the atrocities that were practiced there, and thus had a share in the guilt. It was not an invitation that could be refused. The footage was shot by the famed Hollywood director Billy Wilder and formed part of a documentary to be called Death Mills. Wilder's reputation had been established the previous year with the release of Double Indemnity, a film that is regularly to be found in the top 10 of the American Film Institute, together with one of his later films, Sunset Boulevard. He was one of a number of Jewish German refugees who fled from the Third Reich and would leave a deep impression on Hollywood. His mother, grandmother, and stepfather stayed behind and were murdered in Auschwitz. The spectator witnesses the changed expressions of the citizens as they start out on what they appear to take to be a Sunday outing, and return shocked to their very core at what they were invited to inspect. Were they aware of what had been taking place? Very likely in outline, if not in detail. The zoo just outside the perimeter wire of the prisoners' encampment had been opened to outside visitors, and the same smoke and smells that alerted the ex-Prime Minister of France, Léon Blum, would have wafted down to Weimar. Despite this, we should pause before allocating too much blame to them, whilst exonerating ourselves. These enforced visits were symbolic of the punishment that many felt should be administered to Germany as a whole. As the world was made increasingly aware of the horrors that had taken place in the camps, there were cries that the German people should be made to pay. Field Marshal Montgomery suggested that the German people should receive only 1,000 calories of food a day, in retaliation for the 800 calories that had been allotted but not always received by the starving prisoners of Belsen. Ironically, at the time, many Germans were not obtaining even the 1,000 calories the Field Marshal suggested doling out to them. Amidst the calls for stern justice to be administered to the nation, one voice in Britain stood out against the tide. This was that of the Jewish publisher, Victor Gollancz, the Jewish founder of the seminal Left Book Club. He had previously issued wake-up calls during the war, warning the world of what was happening under the Nazis in his pamphlet, Let My People Go. Now, in 1945, he denounced the hypocrisy of a world that claimed ignorance and innocence. He listed the newspapers that had published stories of the atrocities of the camps. In his pamphlet, What Buchenwald Means, he called for recognition that the largest number of sufferers in the camps had themselves been German, and that many Germans had stood up against Hitler regardless of their own safety. The concentration camps were themselves a symbol of the German opposition to Hitler. If Jews were condemned because of their race, the others fell foul of the Gestapo because of their beliefs. But these were not common men. In the eyes of Gallants, each one was a hero. If guilt were to be assigned, he argued, where would the blame lie? With the average German who did nothing, knowing that any action he undertook might result in himself and his family being transported to one of the camps, or with those of other nations who, equally aware of the facts and under no threat from the Third Reich, did nothing? As Anthony Eden had said, the trouble with Hitler was not that he was a Nazi at home. The trouble was that he would not stay at home. In other words, as far as the Allies were concerned, Hitler was free to do as he wished within his own sphere. With the results of this policy now evident, the Allies were eager that the German nation should bear all the guilt. Amongst other grisly relics that the Weimar citizens were invited to inspect were samples of tattooed skin and 2 shrunken heads. The heads were thought to be those of Polish prisoners who had fallen foul of the SS regime. They were to be used as evidence of atrocities in the Nuremberg trials, though no individual was specifically charged with their creation. Those placed under arrest for crimes committed at Buchenwald were not tried at Nuremberg, but at Dachau, the mother camp. Investigations were first carried out in Buchenwald itself, and evidence, including files said to weigh more than 3 tons, a tribute to the bureaucratic nature of the SS, was collected. 6,000 suspects were arrested and 793 were brought to trial. There was one main trial, followed by 25 further trials. By the end of the main trial, 22 persons had been sentenced to hang, 5 faced life imprisonment, and 4 prison terms of 10 to 20 years. The Dachau trials commenced on April the 11th, 1947, more than 2 years after the liberation. The defendants included the camp commander Hermann Pister, who was sentenced to death, but died in jail in 1948 before the sentence could be carried out. The wife of his predecessor, Ilse Koch, was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment, which, in a controversial decision, Commander Clay, Chief of the Armed Forces, commuted to 4 years. She reaped little benefit from his clemency, since, on release, she was rearrested, tried by the German High Court, and resentenced to life imprisonment. She committed suicide in 1967. Her husband's literally deadly enemy, and the man directly responsible for all that had taken place in the camp, the senior SS and Gestapo chief of Weimar, Prince Josias of Waldeck and Pyrmont, fared rather better. He was also initially sentenced to life, which was commuted to 20 years, and he was released after 3 years on grounds of ill health. He would die in the same year as Ilse Koch, 1967, head of the noble house of Waldeck and Pyrmont. 3 doctors were also tried: Hans Seiler, August Bender, and Werner Granus. Seiler was sentenced to death by hanging, commuted to 20 years, and was released in 1952. August Bender, who found a number of ex-prisoners willing to testify in his defense, was sentenced to 10 years and released after 3. Werner Groenus was sentenced to life, which was later commuted to 20 years. Of the 22 persons condemned to be hanged at Landsberg jail, General Clay was only willing to confirm 15 of the sentences. Hans Merbach was the 35-year-old in charge of the death train that took the prisoners from Buchenwald to Dachau. Martin Rosenfeld, a witness, testified that 350 prisoners were shot as they walked to the train station at Weimar, of which personally killed 10. He was further said to have killed civilians at a stopping point in Czechoslovakia who had brought food for the prisoners. Rosenfeld further claimed that Merbach had ordered all the French prisoners out of the boxcars and had them shot. Merbach denied the charges. He claimed that whatever confessions he had made were forced out of him after multiple beatings. Many defendants appearing before the war crimes tribunals also made similar claims. He made a final plea. "Judge me as a man who tried to do his best. I had to obey crazy orders. Until the end, I always tried my best." All the condemned were held to be guilty unless they could prove their innocence. This Merbach failed to do. He was the last of the condemned to hang, and the sentence was carried out on January the 14th, 1949, 17 months after his sentence was passed. Of the others who received the death penalty, one was Emil Pleissner, whose latest promotion had been to become head of the crematorium, where many of the murders had been carried out. He had run the crematorium together with Hermann Hellwig, the SS Labour Detachment officer, who stated that he had personally hanged 250 individuals in the crematorium cellar. He received the same sentence. Friedrich Wilhelm, the Obersturmführer who had been in charge of the inmates' hospital, also received the death penalty. Hans Theodor Schmidt, the adjutant and legal officer, was another. Richard Kohler, another who claimed to have made a false confession under torture, was found guilty of killing Allied prisoners. Max Schubert received the death penalty as the officer in charge of the killing of Soviet prisoners in the stables. Hermann Grossmann, commander of 2 of the Buchenwald subcamps, was condemned for the shooting of Soviet prisoners during an air raid. Josef Kessel, who admitted to having punished prisoners but never having killed them, received the death sentence nevertheless. All sentenced to hang were serving members of the SS, with one exception. This was Hans Wolf, a capo recruited from the criminal elements of the camp, a man who had been deeply involved in financial corruption and also party to the murder of a number of prisoners. Another hanged for his misdeeds was Dr. Waldemar Hoven, a medical officer who had been deeply involved with Isa Koch and had been found guilty of murder at the time of the Buchenwald investigation carried out by the SS investigator, Major George Morgan. Although sentenced to hang under the laws of the Third Reich, he had managed to survive, to become a stool pigeon to the Allied forces and a witness at the Nuremberg trials. Despite his efforts to ingratiate himself, he was to end up on the gallows. The so-called hangman of Buchenwald, Martin Somner, had been sent to the front by the same investigator for misdeeds during the time of Koch and returned minus an arm and a leg. Little attention was paid to the former jailer, who had revelled in his reputation as the most hated man in Buchenwald. Things were to change when he petitioned for an increase in his army pension. In 1958 he was tried by a German court and sentenced to life in prison. Execution was carried out in Landsberg am Lech. This was the principal site of execution for German war criminals. Altogether, 275 convicts were executed for their crimes, the final execution having taken place on June 8, 1951. 27 years earlier, Hitler had served a sentence of 8 months here for his attempt to overthrow the state by violence in the failed coup that gained the title of the Beer Hall Putsch. The right wing had ensured that his stay in jail would be a pleasant one, and numerous facilities were made available to him. It was during this time that he dictated to his deputy Rudolf Hess the work that would lay down his blueprint for the Third Reich. With the closure of the jail of Landsberg by the Americans in 1958, the last page of that Reich could said to have been written. In fact, it was in this very year that a rewritten history of Buchenwald was to be celebrated, and a new re-edited page published. In 1958, the Communist East German government, or SED, inaugurated Buchenwald as a place of national memory. It was to become known as the Red Olympus, the most hallowed ground of the national legends created by the German Democratic Republic. In February 1945, the Big Three, Roosevelt, Stalin and Churchill, had redrawn the map of Europe, splitting Germany into 3 zones of influence. Weimar was in the Soviet slice of the pie, and accordingly in July the Americans withdrew, having released the last of the prisoners. Within 4 weeks, the camp had turned into a new instrument of repression, this time against those Germans who had been influential followers or managers of the Nazi movement. By the end of 1945, there were 6,000 people consigned to the camp. People were arrested on the flimsiest of evidence and interned without trial. It became an easy way for the unscrupulous to settle old scores, and so little attention was paid to the establishing of guilt that a good Democrat should be denounced by a former Nazi and end up back in the same camp from which he had recently been released. No contact was allowed with the outside world, not even the minimum that had been permitted under the Nazis, where sporadic and vetted communications did take place. Executions continued throughout the camp network. Death came mainly through neglect, as had happened in the majority of cases under Nazi rule. The main causes were overcrowding, lack of food, poor sanitary conditions, and the cold. The percentage of prisoners to die in the camp was even higher than that reached during the Third Reich. The dead were buried in the surrounding woods. A number of inmates were transported to the Soviet Union and not heard of again. On the camp's closure, the remaining 2,415 prisoners were handed over to the German Democratic Republic. From now on, the subject of the Soviet camp and the mass grave surrounding it was one to be avoided. The barracks and the buildings were demolished, and there were plans either to eradicate the camp or to leave simply the main gate standing to watch over a reforested patch. Plans changed during the 50s as the revision of history crept on apace. In 1955, the Board of Curators was formed for the building of national memorial sites at 3 camps, one of which was Buchenwald. That they would play a role in the war of propaganda was made manifest when they were designated places of warning and remembrance. The memorial was divided into 2 parts, the former camp and the totalitarian monuments created to proclaim the wonders of one system of tyranny while denouncing another. The huge erections created a small distance from Buchenwald dwarf the remains of the former camp. The plaques within the camp, commemorating the deaths of the Jews and Soviet prisoners of war, are put into the shade by the sheer scale of those dedicated to the communist resistance fighters in the Street of Nations. This street connects the 3 ring tombs, which were natural depressions in the earth where the SS is said to have dumped the ashes of over 3,000 victims. A large bell tower dominates the row of tombs where 1,286 urns of the ashes of Buchenwald victims lie. The tower itself contains soil from all the other concentration camps placed under a bronze plaque. It stands where the Bismarck Tower, erected in 1901, once stood, and where SS summer celebrations were held. It was a popular spot for day trippers. In 1945, the SS had taken it over to store the urns of more than 1,000 prisoners. The memorial site became a shrine of the new German communist state. Here could be found the remains of the communist leader Ernst Thälmann. This was not a tribute to the victims of the Holocaust, but a monument to the anti-fascist fighters that had brought down the Nazi Empire. The ruling theme to this new park was that of triumphalism. The liberation of the camp by the Americans at 2:30 p.m. was suppressed in the official history of Buchenwald, and the fact that the camp had been a place of death and suffering for whole classes of people who paid no homage to the Marxist faith was ignored. So too, of course, was the role of those political prisoners who as capos had underpinned the reign of the SS. A myth was created that the camp was made up of anti-fascist activists who continued to work against the regime even after arrest and incarceration. They secretly prepared for a mass uprising which overthrew the oppressor, and the camp clock stopped at 3:15 as if to record forever the time of this courageous uprising. The massive statue of anti-fascist resistance records this revamped version of history, where 10 defiant men and 1 brave boy stand up against the might of the Dark Empire. Mass meetings, military parades and flag raisings took place here. It became compulsory for school children to visit a concentration camp at least once during their school life, the purpose being as more to reinforce their belief in the system under which they were being raised than to learn the lessons of history. Since unification, the Soviet myths have been exploded, and detailed research has been carried out to reconstruct a detailed and veracious account of what really occurred at Buchenwald. Whatever distortions of the truth there may have been in the past, there is no doubting that in Buchenwald and its subcamps was witnessed some of the most monstrous treatment that man has ever inflicted on man. One former inmate, Eugen Kogan, called his analysis of Buchenwald and the concentration camp system the theory and practice of hell. What you have seen is where hell on earth took place.